The morning of my 63rd birthday, I came home to find my study had become someone else's bedroom. Not rearranged, not borrowed, converted. The mahogany desk I'd had since 1987 was pushed against the wall at an angle, like an afterthought. My files, 30 years of project records, tax documents, the folder with my late mother's letters, was stacked in 2 cardboard boxes in the hallway. My reading chair was gone entirely. In its place, a gaming chair, neon green, still in its plastic wrap. A 65-inch monitor sat on a folding table where my bookshelf used to be. I stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough that the refrigerator clicked on in the kitchen, ran its cycle, and clicked off again. Then I walked to the kitchen counter and found the note. It was written on the back of a grocery receipt, in my wife's handwriting. Martin needed the space. We'll explain when we get back. Dinner at 7. That was it. No happy birthday. No apology. Just, Martin needed the space. I set the note back down. I smoothed it flat with my thumb. And then I sat at the kitchen table in my own house, in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, and I thought about how I had gotten here. My wife and I had been married for 11 years. I was 52 when we met, recently retired from 28 years in civil engineering. She was 46, smart, warm in the way that a wood fire is warm. You want to sit near it. She had 2 adult children from her first marriage. Her daughter lived across the country, called every Sunday, stayed out of things. Her son, Martin, was 24 when I met him and lived 40 minutes away. I did not go into that marriage naively. I knew blended families were complicated. I had been married before, briefly, in my 30s, and that had taught me that love was not a feeling you fell into. It was a decision you made every day. I was prepared to work. What I was not prepared for was Martin. He was not a bad person in the obvious ways. He didn't yell or steal or lie in ways you could prove. He was bad in the slower way, the way water gets into a foundation. Not dramatic, just constant. Just always there, applying pressure in places you didn't notice until the damage was done. The first year, he came to dinner every Sunday. That was fine. I liked it, actually. I grilled. We watched football. It felt like something real. Then Sunday dinners became Sunday through Tuesday. Then he started leaving things at the house. A jacket, a phone charger, eventually a toiletry bag. My wife never said anything about it. I mentioned it once, gently. She said, "He's comfortable here. Isn't that a good thing?" I said yes, because I thought it was. Because I was trying. By year 3, Martin had a key. He'd had a string of jobs that never lasted more than 8 or 9 months. Graphic design, then social media management, then something vague involving cryptocurrency that I never fully understood and that disappeared without explanation sometime around the holidays. Each time something ended, my wife would say, "He just needs some time to find his footing." And I would nod, and we would wait for him to find his footing. I helped him too, not because I was asked, though I was often, but because I wanted to, because I had more than enough, and because I believe that a man who helps his family is the kind of man I wanted to be. I helped him with rent twice, once when his roommate left without notice, once when he lost the social media job. Each time I wrote the check, I told myself it was the last time, not out of resentment, out of belief that he'd get there. I paid for his car insurance for 14 months after he rear-ended someone on the freeway and his premiums jumped to something he said he couldn't afford. I sat with him through 3 job interviews over Zoom, listened to him practice his answers. I put him in touch with 2 of my former colleagues who could have opened real doors for him. He took none of those introductions anywhere. I noticed that. I filed it away. What I didn't file away, what I should have examined more carefully, was the way my wife talked about him. Not the content of what she said, but the texture. There was never accountability in it. Never, Martin needs to do better. Always, Martin is going through something. Always, you have to understand his history. Always some context that explained why the rules that applied to everyone else didn't quite apply to him. I understood that she loved her son. I loved my own children. I had 2 from my first marriage, both grown, both out of state. I understood what it was to look at your child and see them struggling and want to absorb every bit of it yourself. But there is a difference between protecting your child and dissolving every boundary so completely that they never have to develop any of their own. I understood that difference. My wife, I came to see, did not. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't care. The shift, the real one, the one I should have recognized what it was, came about 2 years ago. Martin lost his apartment, his lease ended, his roommates scattered, and he arrived at our door on a Saturday morning with 4 bags and a tired look and said, "Just for a month or two." My wife did not ask me first. She told me afterward that same Saturday while I was making coffee. "He needed somewhere to go," she said. "You understand," I said. Of course, because I did. Because a month or 2 was manageable. Because I still believed that this was temporary, that this was a bump in a road that was otherwise going somewhere. That was 22 months ago. Martin had the guest room. That was fine. It was there, unused, tucked at the end of the hallway near the garage. He kept to himself mostly. Left dishes in the sink more than I'd like. But I let that go. Left lights on in rooms he'd left 20 minutes ago. But I let that go too. These were small things. I was not going to be the man who counted lights. What I could not let go, what I tried to let go and could not, was the slow colonization of the rest of the house. His things started appearing in the living room. A second monitor on the side table. A headset. Wires. His laundry, folded on the couch, waiting to be moved for 2 or 3 days before someone moved it. His friends coming by at 10, 11 at night, letting themselves in the side door because Martin had apparently given them the code to the keypad. I mentioned the keypad to my wife. She said she'd talk to him. She didn't, or if she did, nothing changed. I mentioned it again. She looked at me the way you look at someone who is being unreasonable about something small, and she said, "They're not hurting anything, are they?" No, they weren't hurting anything. Not technically, but I was 62 years old, and I could not sit in my own living room after 9 o'clock without wondering whether someone was going to walk in through the side door and claim a corner of my couch. And then, 4 months ago, Martin started mentioning my study. Not directly. He never asked directly. He mentioned at dinner that the guest room didn't have good enough light for the kind of work he was trying to do. He mentioned a week later that he'd found a great setup online. A standing desk, a ring light, a monitor arm. But that it needed a room with a window. He mentioned the week after that he'd heard some people did their best work in a quiet room away from the rest of the house. My study had a window. My study was quiet. My study was away from the rest of the house. I heard all of this. I did not respond to it directly because I did not want to have the conversation that responding to it would require. I told myself he was just talking. I told myself nothing would actually happen. That was the mistake I keep coming back to. Not any of the earlier ones. That one, the moment I heard what was coming and chose to believe it wasn't. So there I was on the morning of my birthday, sitting at my kitchen table reading a grocery receipt that told me Martin had needed the space. I sat there for a while, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more. I wasn't thinking about what to do. Not yet. I was just letting myself feel it. That is something I have learned in 63 years, that younger people sometimes haven't. You have to let yourself feel the thing before you can think clearly about it. If you skip that step, you make decisions from a place of heat, and decisions from heat are almost always ones you regret. So I felt it. I felt the anger, which was quieter than I expected. Not a fire. More like a very cold, very steady pressure behind my sternum. I felt the embarrassment, which was worse. Not because anyone was watching. Because I watching. Because some part of me knew that I had seen this coming for a long time, and I had kept choosing to believe it wouldn't arrive. And then I felt something else, something I hadn't felt in this house in a while. Clarity. I got up from the table. I poured my coffee down the sink. I'd let it go cold. I went to my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor. I had a personal account that predated the marriage and had always remained separate. and I wanted to review exactly what was in it and what it covered. He walked me through it. It took about 15 minutes. The second call was to a family law attorney I had met once, years ago, at a neighborhood association meeting. He remembered me. I told him my situation in broad strokes. He told me what my options were, and more importantly, what my rights were. I took notes on the back of the grocery receipt, right next to my wife's handwriting. Then I opened my laptop and I made a list. The house was mine. I had bought it in 2009, 12 years before the marriage, with money from my engineering pension and a modest inheritance from my father. It was in my name alone. My wife had moved in when we married. We had never changed the title. The utilities were in my name. The Wi-Fi was in my name, Martin's car insurance. I had continued paying that quietly out of some combination of habit and hope, was something I had set up through my own account. I sat with that list for a long time. Then I made a third call. To my insurance provider. I explained that I needed to remove a vehicle from my policy. The representative was helpful. It took 8 minutes. I did not cancel the Wi-Fi. I did not change the locks. I did not do anything dramatic or irreversible that evening. I'd spoken to a lawyer. I knew what I could do, and I knew what order to do it in, and I knew that the conversation I needed to have had to come first. I went to the garage, got the 2 boxes with my files, and carried them to the bedroom. I set them in the corner. Then I went to the hallway closet, found an old folding chair, and carried it to what used to be my study. I sat in the folding chair in the middle of the room, next to the gaming chair in its plastic wrap, and I looked at where my desk had been pushed. I had bought that desk at an estate sale in Chattanooga in 1987, when I was 26 years old and had just started my first real job. I'd driven it 3 hours home in the back of a borrowed pickup truck. I'd refinished it twice. I had drafted the plans for a pedestrian bridge on that desk that was still standing in raw Kentucky. It was pushed against the wall at an angle like an afterthought. I stayed in that room until I heard the front door. I came in laughing, Martin first. I could tell by the footsteps the particular weight and rhythm of them. Then my wife. Then a pause, the sound of bags being set down. "Hey," Martin called from the hallway. "You home?" "In here," I said. He appeared in the doorway of the study. He looked at me in the folding chair, and something moved across his face. Surprise, then a quick recalibration, then something that was trying to be casual. "Oh," he said. "Didn't expect you in here." "I live here," I said, quietly. No sharpness in it, just a fact. My wife appeared behind him. She looked at me, then at the room, then back at me. She said, "Honey, we were going to talk to you about this tonight." "I know," I said. "We're going to talk about it now." Martin started to say something about the light and the setup and the work he'd been trying to do. I let him finish. I did not interrupt him. When he was done, I said, "Martin, when did I tell you it was okay to move my things?" He said I hadn't exactly, but that Mom had said. I looked at my wife. She said she thought I wouldn't mind, that it was just temporary, that she'd meant to mention it before I got home. I said, "On my birthday." She said, "I know the timing wasn't." I said, "On my birthday you moved my belongings into boxes in the hallway, without asking, and you left me a note on a grocery receipt." She didn't say anything. I said, "I want to talk about what happens next. Tonight. The 3 of us. At that table." I gestured toward the kitchen. "But I want you both to understand something first. This is my house. I bought it 14 years before we were married. It is in my name. I am not angry. I am not going to yell, but I am done allowing things to happen in this house that I have not agreed to." Martin said, "That's kind of an aggressive way to, Martin." I said his name the way my own father used to say mine when I was about to make an error. Not loud, just final, I'm not talking to you right now." He stopped. My wife's face had gone through several things while I was talking. I'd known her long enough to read most of them. The first was defensiveness. The second was something that might have been guilt. The third, the one that arrived slowly and settled, was something I recognized but hadn't seen in a long time. Concern. Real concern. Not for Martin. For us. Good, I thought. We needed that to be in the room. The conversation that night lasted almost 3 hours. It was not easy. There were moments when my wife cried. There were moments when Martin pushed back hard, told me I'd never really accepted him, told me I was making this about control. I let him say what he needed to say. I didn't take the bait. What I said was this: I had spent 11 years trying to support this family. I had written checks I hadn't been asked to write. I had made introductions that led nowhere. I had given time and money and space, including literal physical space, with less and less in return. And I had done it because I believed in the marriage, and I believed in the people in it. And I had watched, over those 11 years, as the expectations had quietly shifted in one direction, always toward more from me, always toward less accountability from Martin, until I came home on my birthday to find that my own study had been converted without my knowledge or consent. I said, "That is not a marriage, that is a subsidy." My wife flinched. Martin said, "So what do you want?" I told him. I wanted him out of my house within 30 days. I would not be renewing his car insurance. I had already made that call. I would give him 1 month of assistance, finding a new place, financial assistance, a real amount, as a final gesture, because I was not cruel and because I wanted to do right by him even now. But in 30 days, I needed my house back. Martin said that was impossible. He said 30 days wasn't enough time. He said I was throwing him out with nothing. I said, "I'm giving you 30 days and a check. That's more than the notice I got." He looked at his mother. She looked at the table. I turned to my wife and I said, "And you and I are going to see a marriage counselor, this week if possible, because I don't know yet what I want to do about us. But I know I can't figure that out in the same house with this same dynamic. Something has to change." She nodded. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry about your birthday." I said, "That's a start." Martin moved out in 26 days. He found a room in a shared house about 15 miles away. I wrote him a check for $2,000, which covered his first and last month's deposit. He took it without saying thank you. He also, on his way out, took the gaming chair he'd left in my study, which I thought was both predictable and fair. I carried my desk back to its original position that same afternoon. It took me longer than it should have. I'm 63 and my lower back has opinions, but I did it myself. I refinished the corner where it had been scuffed when it was moved. I put my books back on the shelves. I set my reading chair in the corner by the window. Then I sat down in it, and I did not do anything for a while. I just sat there. The afternoon light came in at an angle the way it does in October, long and thin and golden, and I listened to the quiet of my house. It sounded different than it had in 2 years. It sounded like mine. My wife and I started seeing a counselor 3 weeks after that night. It has been 6 months now. I will not tell you it is easy because it is not. There are sessions where old things come to the surface, and they are heavy and they take time. But there are also sessions where I look across the room at this woman I chose 11 years ago, and I see her trying, really trying, not to explain, not to defend, just to understand how we got from where we started to that kitchen counter and that grocery receipt. We are not all the way back to where we were. I don't know if that place still exists in the same form, but we are somewhere new, and it is honest, and honesty, real honesty, the kind that costs something, is more than a lot of people get. Martin calls his mother once a week. He does not call me. That is fine. I did not expect him to, and I do not need him to. What I needed was to stop quietly funding a dynamic that was making me smaller in my own life. I've stopped. That is enough. I still have my mother's letters in the filing cabinet in my study. I found them in the cardboard box when I unpacked. still in their rubber band, still in the order she'd sent them. Earliest on top, the way she always did things. I sat on the floor that afternoon and read 3 of them. She wrote the way she taught, practical, a little dry, deeply warm underneath. In one of them, from 1989, she said, "You were always too patient with the wrong things, and not patient enough with the right ones. I hope you figure out the difference before it costs you too much." She died in 2004. She never met my wife, never knew this house, never saw any of this. But she had my number, the way good mothers do. I think I'm figuring it out. Later than I should have. But that is how most real things work. You arrive at them when you arrive, not a moment before. I feel different than I did a year ago. Lighter in a way that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't carried something heavy for a long time and then set it down. I found something I hadn't felt in that house in years. I found quiet. And in the quiet, I found myself again. There is something nobody tells you about being patient for too long. It stops looking like a virtue and starts looking like permission. I think about the years I spent telling myself that helping Martin was the right thing to do. And it was, at first, writing that first check when his roommate disappeared overnight. That was decent. That was the kind of thing a man does for his family. But somewhere in the years that followed, decent became expected, and expected became demanded. And I kept showing up for each new version of the arrangement without ever asking whether the arrangement was still fair. That was not virtue. That was avoidance wearing virtue's clothes. What I had to reckon with sitting at my own kitchen table on my birthday reading a note on a grocery receipt was that nothing Martin did would have been possible without my cooperation. Not the key. Not the side door code. Not the car insurance running quietly out of my account month after month. He didn't take those things. I handed them over one at a time because confronting each one felt harder than absorbing it. That is a failure of judgment. Mine, not only his. And sitting with that honestly, without excusing myself and without drowning in it, was the first real thing I did right in a long time. The second was understanding what kind of man I actually wanted to be in response to it. Not the man who blows up. Not the man who disappears into bitterness. I had seen what that looked like in other people, and it didn't appeal to me at 63 any more than it would have at 30. What I wanted was to act from a place of clarity instead of heat, to know my rights, know my options, and speak plainly about what I needed. That required a certain kind of mental discipline. I hadn't been practicing. I had to get quiet enough to find it again, and then I had to follow through. That is the part people underestimate. Understanding what's wrong is one thing. Actually calling the lawyer. Actually sitting in that folding chair and waiting for them to come home. Actually saying, "This is my house," out loud to people who had stopped acting like it. That takes something different. Not anger. Not pride. Just the willingness to hold a hard line even when it's uncomfortable. Even when someone you care about is looking at you like you've become a stranger. Carol and I are still working through it. I don't know yet what that will look like in 5 years, but I know that what changed between that birthday and now wasn't the circumstances, it was me. I stopped waiting for other people to decide when enough was enough. I decided. Martin is fine. He has a roof and a job, and his mother still calls him every Sunday. What he doesn't have is my study, my patience, or my checking account. That is a fair outcome. Actions accumulate. So do silences. Eventually both of them arrive somewhere, and you either reckon with where they brought you, or you don't. I chose to reckon. I found that the quiet on the other side of that choice was not emptiness. It was room, actual, physical, breathable room to remember who I had been before I started making myself so small.